Now we can investigate the background to domestic politics in the United States by looking at some of the conditions faced by farmers, as well as the economic crisis that hit the nation in the 1890s. In the years after the Civil War, many people moved out west in order to establish their own farms. If you remember, as shown in lecture number 2, things like the Homestead Act encouraged people to move west. Some people prospered, but many hadn't. Farmers faced a variety of different problems in the late 1800s as shown by this table. The green areas indicate where farmers had enough income in order to pay for their expenses. However, the pink areas shows where their income fell short. Beginning in the mid-1880s, we see several years in a row where farmers didn't make enough money in order to pay their bills. In order to provide support for each other as they faced hard times, many farmers began to organize in a group. The name of that group was the Grange. The Grange was founded in 1867 by a member of the Department of Agriculture named Oliver Kelly. Their goal was to provide education and emotional support to farmers in the American West. They were very often angry at practices of the railroad. The railroad companies often gave discounts to large businesses and charged higher rates to farmers. By 1880, membership very often dropped when prices temporarily recovered, but they showed that farmers could be a potential political force in U.S. politics. The entire nation faced economic problems with the so-called Panic of 1893. In many ways, this was associated with the railroad industry, which had grown up until the 1890s, yet the growth slowed by that decade. By the end of 1893, over 74 railroads, several banks, and many businesses had failed. Unemployment was incredibly high, between 20 and 25% nationally. Many demonstrated their anger at the lack of government involvement to help by joining Coxey's army. He and a group of many others demanded that the government sponsor a system of public works in order to bring those unemployment levels down. They marched to Washington, D.C., however he and many others were arrested for trespassing, and it disbanded. The Panic of 1893 was the worst economic depression to face the nation until the decade of the 1930s. Some were angry as the election of 1896 approached, with President Grover Cleveland, who took a hands-off approach to resolving the depression. The election of 1896 was held in the backdrop of the failing economy. There were two major candidates who ran for the presidency in that year. The Democratic candidate in this election was William Jennings Bryan. He was a member of Congress from Nebraska and also quite young. He was only 36 years old. The base of his support came from many farmers, particularly those out west. He was popular among farmers due to his stance of free silver. This would increase the money supply and help people who were in debt. Farmers were often in debt, so that's why many farmers supported his candidacy. The Republican nominee was William McKinley. He was a veteran of the Civil War, a former congressman, and a two-term governor of Ohio. In opposition to Bryan's stance of free silver, he wanted the United States to maintain its support of the gold standard. In general, McKinley had the support of the business community, as they feared what might happen if Bryan's policies were adopted. They also agreed with McKinley's goal to maintain high tariffs to protect American manufacturers. Well, in the end, William McKinley won with a percentage of the popular vote of about 51%. Notice where Bryan had most of his support, the South as well as segments of the West. William McKinley was very strong in the Northeast, the Great Lakes, and in California and Oregon. The lecture's focus will now switch to some of the key issues surrounding the nation's foreign policy of this era. We'll begin with some background to the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War took place in 1898, and as the title would suggest, it was fought between the Americans and Spain. However, the controversy between the two countries really was over conditions faced in Cuba. Cuba was a Spanish colony, and the American people were very sympathetic to the Cubans as they were fighting a revolution against this colonial power. The President of the United States during this time was William McKinley. Now, the reason why the American people even knew about what was going on in Cuba is because of the so-called Yellow Press. These were a series of journalists who often stretched the facts in order to sell newspapers. There were two major newspapers, the New York World and the New York Journal, who were engaged in a titanic duel of circulation as they tried to sell newspapers to the American people. They began to report many of the atrocities, some of which were true, some of which weren't, which were taking place in Cuba. The New York World was run by Joseph Pulitzer, and the New York Journal was operated by William Randolph Hearst. While the media sparked American interest in events going on in Cuba, it was the sinking of an American battleship, the USS Maine, in February of 1898 that led to actual fighting. The Maine was located in Havana Harbor, as shown in this map, in early 1898 when an explosion rocked the ship. At the time, it was believed that the Spanish had mined the harbor, causing the deaths of over 200 Americans. However, it's now believed that an internal explosion, probably from the boiler room, was the cause of the Maine's demise. But at the time, the true cause of the explosion was unknown. Combat took place in both the Philippines and Cuba. Under the direction of Admiral Dewey in May of 1898, U.S. forces steamed into Manila Bay and either captured or destroyed all 10 Spanish ships at the cost of only 1 American life. U.S. troops then occupied Manila by mid-August. In the words of John Hay, this was a splendid little war. It was a splendid little war for a variety of reasons. First of all, a new hero had emerged. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt had led a volunteer group of forces to victory at San Juan Hill. The war itself only lasted 6 weeks. The Americans won, and, as a result of American involvement in this war, the United States had acquired a vast overseas empire. This map identifies several areas outside of the contiguous United States that were acquired by the U.S. in the late 1800s. The best examples as a result of the Spanish-American War would include the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Some may have described this as a splendid little war. However, all war comes with some level of cost. Fewer than 400 Americans died in combat, but over 5,000 died from disease or other ailments. American involvement in the Spanish-American War demonstrated that the U.S. military was woefully unprepared. The U.S. was acting like many other European nations with its acquisition of territory like the Philippines or Puerto Rico. However, some argued that this violated the principles of the Declaration of Independence, upon which the United States had been formed in the late 1700s. Now that the core of the lecture has been completed, we can review some of the main issues which were discussed. Well, this lecture has covered a lot of different topics, one of which was daily life. Life was difficult for many immigrants and farmers at the turn of the century. However, black Americans very often faced sharecropping and legalized segregation. By 1900, the United States was emerging from its economic depression, but it had also become an imperial power, which set the stage for American growth throughout the 20th century. Well, this concludes Lecture 4 for this class, The United States at 1900. I hope you learned something new today. The next few slides will show some of the sources used for this lecture, as well as some additional hyperlinks to find more information on these topics. Have a great day.